Today's episode is brought to you by Alexandra Park BJJ. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a full-contact martial art and combat sport that was developed in Brazil in the 20th century. With roots in Judo and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, has been developed and refined into a unique grappling art with the aim to allow a smaller and weaker individual to beat a bigger and stronger opponent with the application of proper technique. Based in Muswell Hill, North London, Alexandra Park BJJ's classes are designed so that you can develop your fitness levels, balance, coordination, and flexibility in a no-pressure environment, and to provide the opportunity to start a new sport at a reasonable price. At Alexandra Park BJJ, we aim to be inclusive so that everyone can benefit from this incredible art, not just the athletic or ultra-competitive. To book your free class, head over to alexandraparkbjj.co.uk or email inquiries at alexandraparkbjj.co.uk.
Welcome to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast looking at audiobooks both big and small, as well as radio plays, narrative podcasts, anything audiobook-ish. This podcast may contain spoilers, rants, curse words, mispronunciations of names and places, and more.
Hello everybody, you're listening to Audiobookish. My name is Fahed Rahman and I'm joined by Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And this is the first in our series of special episodes supporting the Nibbies, kind of the Booksellers Book of the Year awards. And this year we are going to be reviewing all the books on the shortlist for Book of the Year audiobook non-fiction. And the two books we're going to be discussing today are Menopausing by Davina McCall and Dr. Naomi Potter, and Parenting Hell by Rob Beckett and Josh Widdicombe. And the first book we're going to discuss is Menopausing by Davina McCall and Dr. Naomi Potter. It's read by Dr. Naomi Potter, Michael Douglas, not that one, Dr. Nigat Arif, Cheryl Phelps Gardner, Mariam Grace, Kristen Atherton, and Richard Hughes. And I'll read out the...
And of course, Davina McCall.
And I'll just read out the blurb for that. Menopause affects every woman, and yet so many approach it with shame, fear, misinformation, or silence. Why is no one talking about this? Who has the correct information, and how can we get it? That's how this book came about. We are going to tell you the truth, so you can make an informed decision about your life and your body. For too long, women have had to keep quiet about the menopause, its onset, its symptoms, its treatments, and what it means for us. Menopausing will build an empowered, supportive community to break this terrible silence once and for all. By exploring and explaining the science, debunking damaging myths, smashing the taboos around the perimenopause and menopause, this book will equip women to make the most informed decisions about their health and their lives. Menopausing will also celebrate the sharing of stories, enabling women to feel less alone, more understood, and talk openly and positively about the menopause. So, as a bloke, this is not a subject I knew an awful lot about. As a woman, how much did you know kind of about the menopause before kind of listening?
Yeah, worryingly, probably a similar amount to you. And that's kind of what the book talks about. It's the fact that this really isn't discussed much. I mean, I have been around recently women going through this sort of phase, and they have been bringing it up more, and that's meant that I've learned a bit about it through that, but not a lot, just like in passing, and more kind of like I often do spend my time around people who are happy to share and things like that, but I think when you broaden it out to, you know, the entirety of society, I can appreciate that it's often not talked about. And yeah, I wasn't taught any of this in school. I haven't really come across any of it just in general. I've ended up stumbling upon books about this topic and picking up bits from them, not reading in full, but knowing some stuff. But yeah, there was so much stuff that I didn't know, so much stuff that was like, oh, you know, that was like I really should have already been armed with the knowledge to piece these things together kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that's kind of the first thing to say about this book is how needed it is, in the sense of just opening up the conversation, creating awareness. It's worrying how little anyone knows. It's important that women know. It's important that anyone who's going to go through it knows, trans men, for example. And it's really important that those who aren't going to go through it also know, to be able to sympathise and understand and help and empower and maybe spot it in other people who haven't necessarily spotted it in themselves before. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that the book claims, but is very true, that it has a place in bringing those conversations about that haven't currently happened. And it talks about stuff that people who were involved in this book have also been involved in the campaigning for things like getting menopause on the curriculum. And yeah, I think that's extremely vital and great that there has been some headway made on that, because it's mad, as they say in the book, that this is something that affects, roughly half the population, and we don't know about it.
I mean, it's actually like really shocking. Like this is not getting like taught in schools.
Yeah.
Let's kind of like get into it. So the book starts off with Davina kind of explaining at the start what her early experience with the perimenopause was, how she's really struggling with her career and her work-life balance and her family relationships. And kind of straight off the bat, there's a real warmth when Davina's talking about that kind of, there's warmth from the tenderness of like compassion for other women going through this situation, but there's also warmth of kind of like rage about kind of the way that she was treated, and how she really only got the treatment that she needed by being in a place of privilege. So I'm just wondering how, and that was a really shock to my system, kind of like listening to those early sections. How did that kind of strike you?
Yeah, and so just picking up on that last bit specifically, the fact that she felt she only actually got the treatment that helped her once she made the decision to go private, and she fully acknowledges the fact that so many people will not be able to do that, and is very much pushing for that sort of menopause care to be available on the NHS as it should be. And, as well as a general conversation about obviously the NHS needing to be better funded and that no one should have to turn to private for anything, and that those who don't have that option should be able to get it from the NHS. But then, specifically thinking about menopause, it's mad that the help isn't available. Certainly some aspects of the help aren't available. I think, wasn't it something about the fact that the testosterone that she felt was a real help in her symptoms can't get prescribed on the NHS? It was something along those lines. There's certainly barriers anyway. Things like that is just appalling. And so, shocking to hear, upsetting to hear, but I think vital that that message is getting out there, that this isn't something that's being covered, in the hopes that it will get addressed. And that was really tough. And also, my biggest takeaway from that introductory bit, and I think I was aware of this, I'm not fully sure how, I have a bit of a deja vu on it, but she tells the story of how she obviously does a lot of work on live television, and she was struggling with how her brain was working, and that she was forgetting things, that she was struggling with the auto cue, so sort of her brain, but maybe also her eyes involved with that. But specifically the memory stuff, and kind of how do you navigate a live show where you're talking to someone and you've forgotten what their names are, which I'm not laughing at in a making fun of way. I'm laughing at in the sense of that awkward laughter that's just peeled out of me by accident, in that it's such a horrible situation to be in. And I think for me personally as well, as horrible as all the symptoms have sounded listening to it, those mental ones that she talks about, brain fog as being kind of the blanket term that's given for those symptoms that people are going through with the menopause and perimenopause, but basically forgetting stuff and not trusting your own brain and getting confused, are terrifying. And as someone who places a lot, probably too much, of my value and self-worth on my memory and kind of, my cognitive skills, it is terrifying that that is a thing, and that you can lose that, and certainly struggle with that because of things like hormone imbalance. And it is a scary thought, and that really does hammer home I guess, how important it is to talk about this, and to get awareness out there so that these things can be caught and people can get treatment, and also just so you can be aware. It's a difficult one because as a worrier and a bit of a hypochondriac, in some ways I'm like, I really didn't need to listen to that because it will stress me out. But on the flip side, I really did, because I came from a place of complete ignorance, and at least now I feel a bit more aware, maybe prepared, who knows. But certainly, the awareness is important, as worrying as it still may be.
Yeah, so, I mean, I was completely unaware of the brain fog and mental stuff that some women potentially go through in the perimenopause and the menopause phase of their lives. And so throughout the book, Davina does most of the heavy lifting, narrating the book, but we do have contributions from Dr. Naomi. She kind of explains more, I don't want to say kind of like dry medical advice, but she goes through kind of like, right, this is like the medical procedures or the what's the right,
like perspective?
The perspective kind of the treatments that might be available to you and whether you might be eligible for them, what the complicating factors would be. But throughout the book, it's interspersed with anecdotes from people that have either written into Davina on social media or got into contact with her some way. And I found those sections, especially while they're talking, there's certain stories from women where they're talking about the effects of menopause and the brain fog. And I wish I knew which performer did which section, because some of them were brilliantly narrated. There's kind of a variety of kind of regional accents. There's young women, middle-aged women, and older women. Their stories were told throughout the book as well, and I found that quite affecting as well.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. It definitely was, and especially hearing some of the ones that were so upsetting because of the devastating effects that it has had. And, the big message that goes through the book is about years lost. And people feeling like they've really lost years of their life because they didn't have the treatment soon enough, often because they just didn't realise that was what was affecting them soon enough. And I think that's one of the worrying things, and one of the things that means this book and others like it that have come onto the market recently, and just all the waves that are happening with it, is that hopefully it means people will recognise menopause and perimenopause sooner and be able to manage those symptoms easier. And especially the things like the brain fog and the forgetting, as well as the kind of mental health, I guess, esque symptoms with kind of, low mood, mood swings in general, as well as the physical symptoms and kind of like joint pain, blah, blah, blah. So much of that, until someone or something makes you take a step back, look at them, piece them together, you're not going to realise that's perimenopause or menopause. Certainly not if you're not even aware that these are the symptoms of it, right?
Yeah.
But I think even if you are, you can easily just gradually, you don't really notice you're forgetting more, or, you're getting tireder, or you're having more mood swings, but you're not going to think that they're necessarily all connected. And certainly if, you're feeling low mood, you're not going to have that proactive mindset of, this is what it is. Let's go get it. It's a kind of slow creeping in of lots of different things that mean that people can go ages without realising that is actually what the problem is. And that's why, it's really important for everyone to be aware of that these are the signs, because they'll be able to spot it in people easier possibly than they can spot it in themselves, and can really help that way. And then also the big thing that's talked about in the book that we'll probably touch on more later, but is the fact that so many doctors aren't aware of it. It was appalling to hear how little / non-existent the training about menopause is for doctors, for GPs, for gynaes. I thought it was mad that they didn't have proper training on it. So all that sort of stuff, very important. And then, very harrowing to hear the stories from individuals who have been like, it was 6 years until I realised this was what it is. And now I know, and now I'm, better from it.
Yeah, it's absolutely appalling when you kind of hear that amount of time potentially being kind of lost from someone's life. So, she does talk about the mental fog, but she also kind of unflinchingly kind of explains some of the more physical symptoms, things like night sweats, kind of hot flashes, that sort of thing. It did kind of make
the vaginal dryness that you're refusing to say.
Yeah. It was just kind of like, it just the way, kind of the way I think she kind of, if I remember my memory serves me correctly, she kind of talks about a lot of these symptoms kind of like onsetting, at a similar point in time, and the way she kind of describes it, how painful vaginal dryness is was it made me really kind of cognizant of the fact that I probably couldn't hack it as a woman. It's just kind of like, that there's a stand-up comedian called Patrice O'Neill, and he kind of said, I couldn't hack it as a woman because if I knew I'd be having a nosebleed every month, but I wouldn't know exactly when it was going to be. I just have kind of like, a tingling feeling before, and then like maybe be in a bad mood for the week after. I just wouldn't be able to live that way. And it's just kind of like, it's tough, man. It's really, really difficult. So that's the other kind of thing that kind of really brought to mind, kind of. Yeah.
This book definitely does make you go, oh, I've had a bad luck of the draw kind of kind of feeling. I think if you are someone who's listening to it from that perspective of, these are the sorts of things that my hormones, my genes, my body means that I experience, definitely. But also some humour in that, I think. And certainly I think Davina does a good job of that, of bringing the humour in it. And some of the people writing in gave some good humour. There was one of my absolute favourite lines in this, where someone said, they were talking about the fact that they were told to like go to therapy, when actually what it was that was affecting their mood was the hormone levels. And I think the phrase was, and you're talking about your abandonment issues when the only abandonment issues you have is that your hormones have fucked off. And that really made me laugh. That was another great contribution of the individual women's stories, is that, they did bring some great humour into it, and that kind of, the fact that even when it is really tough, stuff like that can help pull you through it. And there was a lot of hope in those sections. So like, people were like, oh, I lost, 6 years of my life, but I'm so amazing now, and I'm, living my best life and revitalized, kind of thing. But also there were some where they were like, I've now recognized what it is. I'm now having treatment. I've had treatment for a few years and I'm still really struggling.
Yeah.
And it's important that those were in there, but it does still make it hard to listen to. And especially as someone who is at some point going to go through that, it is difficult to listen to.
Yeah.
But I think important that, these conversations are getting opened up and we're listening to.
Yeah.
The performances of the different kind of contributors, I'm not fully sure how I feel about them being done by different people. Like you say, I love the fact that there was lots of different representation of kind of the different regional voices in there and stuff like that, and different ages. That was great. And I do think it was the right call. I liked that there was actors giving voice to these, as opposed to, I guess, like Davina reading them, especially because she does like respond to them. She kind of says, thank you for sharing your story, kind of stuff. That would be weird if it was the same voice.
Yeah.
However, just because it's not something that I've listened to before, because I haven't listened to a non-fiction where these contributions are voiced by different actors, it was a weird thing to get used to.
Yeah.
And I did find myself, like, at the start, I don't know if you had the same sort of recollection, but it felt a bit like listening to True Crime Story.
Oh, yes.
Because, because they had the little testimonial bits, the little recordings of the different characters in there, sometimes short sections, and it made me feel like I was in that story, part of me was expecting there was a murder was going to happen at some point. It did feel specific to that book, but also because it did feel quite fiction. But as I say, partly just because I haven't listened to many audiobooks that are like that. I don't know how many are out there. I think it is a good call to do that, but as a listener, it is potentially a bit jarring and weird. Did you find that?
I didn't find that so much. I just thought it was, I kind of quite enjoyed it. I didn't kind of find it too jarring, but it's kind of it's interesting you kind of bring up usually that there aren't dramatized. I wouldn't say is dramatized reading the right way.
Well, this is the thing though, because they do bring an actorliness to it, right? And obviously some of them are very much written like someone is making an impassioned speech / rant or whatever, and it really does feel right to give that performance to it. Others you could kind of imagine that maybe that person very calmly wrote out their thoughts and put them down and said them, and therefore them being so enacted is maybe not quite right. I did wonder while I was listening, I wonder what the people who wrote those, if they have listened to the audiobook, what they think about the performance that was given to them.
Yeah.
I just think that would be quite interesting. I do think it was right to do that. I think it was good that they had that passion in it, and especially, yes, some of them really lent to it. But more just an out of interest thing, I would be really keen to know what people thought about the way they're... it's because it's them. And certainly for something like this, where it's so personal to them, I wonder how they feel about someone else performing their words.
Yeah,
it's an interesting thing.
Interesting thing. Because usually, I have listened to other audiobooks where if someone's kind of contributing, it's kind of like a recorded snippet from an interview.
Yeah.
Or something. I've had that, but I've not come across like the dramatized reading that was in that. So that was kind of quite interesting, and I'd be pleased if I saw that in other non-fiction books that I listened to as well. The other thing that I appreciated about the book was her trying to bring in non-white voices. So I really appreciated the section from the Muslim doctor where she was talking about the shame from that particular community in kind of talking about the menopause. And Davina also kind of, at the end of the book, she reads out a really long list of like Instagram and TikTok and Twitter accounts. And she does give kind of quite a lot of prominence to BAME voices in that shout out. So I really appreciated that as well, as kind of Davina kind of being aware of her privilege, both in terms of being kind of quite wealthy, but also coming from kind of a cisgender, I'd say maybe upper middle class white background, and kind of giving voices to people from other communities to kind of share a little bit of their experience of living through the perimenopause and menopause as well.
Yeah, definitely. I was glad that that was there as well. Though that particular section, which I really thought was really good, brings light to a lot of really important points that are worth touching on. That is why it's so important that you don't just consider one perspective, that there is such a breadth of experience, different situation, that was really important that section was in there. But it was just like a small section, and it was kind of dropped in there.
Yeah.
So I did almost feel like it should have been explored more, maybe. I don't know. But I was glad that it was there. But yeah, it felt a bit added in. And kind of similarly, there was a testimonial from a trans man.
Yeah.
And again, very glad that that was there. Very glad that earlier on, Davina sort of says, by women, the way I'm using it in this book is I'm meaning everyone that's going to experience this, which, potentially problematic, but I like the fact that she was outlining the way she's using that word, and that, this is the way it's being done. And yeah, the fact that she considered trans voices, but did also admit in it that she kind of only considered trans voices after she got that testimonial into her. But I kind of quite liked the honesty there, because it sort of shows... It shows the importance of raising these voices, because it shows the fact that so many people won't consider them naturally. And I'm not saying that in a way of criticising the people who don't consider them naturally. That is a fact of how representation is at the moment, that so many people just won't consider certain groups.
Yeah.
And so to acknowledge that gives a very obvious reason as to, and therefore that's why they're in here.
Yeah.
Because they need people to acknowledge them when they might not. And so, yeah, as you say, that goes for trans voices, that goes for non-white voices, that goes for disabled people, and it's discussed in here different conditions and how they interact with the menopause, how there's not enough research into how they interact. So yeah, I do think it did a good job of, at the very least, attempting to represent a wealth of different experiences and different backgrounds, different cultures and things. That, yeah, I think it was definitely, there was a good attempt made there that I think was very important. But on this kind of feeling like that bit was a bit dropped in, as I did, my main criticism with this book was that I didn't love how it was structured, in the sense that I don't really get how it was structured. I didn't feel like it had a very logical structure, just in the sense of the way that I absorbed it, meaning I don't feel like I absorbed it very well. I don't feel like it took me on a journey from not knowing anything to knowing so much, because of the way it dotted around different topics, and I wasn't really sure at any point what section I was in, you know, kind of remembering what section that was. And the main bit that annoyed me was there was so much, and we'll talk about this later, and we'll talk about this later. And we were like 3 hours into the book, and we'll talk about this later. And there was terms that I'd heard like 5 times, and I still didn't really understand what they were, because they were only going to be explained at the latter end of the book. But the fact that they were brought up 5 times means they needed to have been explained earlier, so we understood them throughout. So yeah, I'm intrigued what you thought about that, but I really didn't think, in a sort of sense of teaching us stuff, as well as just following the book in general, I didn't feel it was structured particularly well.
Yes, I would probably agree with that a little bit. My kind of main criticism was that in terms of the content of the book and the way it was structured, it felt like there was a lot of repetition.
Yes.
Or kind of similar stories, and I don't want to say similar stories because every one of the anecdotes is kind of slightly different, but I did feel there's kind of a lot of repetition. And also I probably would agree that it wasn't particularly logically organized in a way.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing about it, that repetition. It was the fact that every section felt like it was covering a lot of the same ground.
Yeah.
And because a lot of that ground, as you say, it is because they're kind of the main, common symptoms and stuff like that. And so, yes, a lot of the testimonials are going to say the same thing. And I didn't really have it about the testimonials themselves. I sort of had it about the stuff that Davina and Dr. Naomi were talking about. It felt like it was going over the same bits. And I was like, yeah, but that other thing that you just kind of mentioned briefly, where was that? And that, it felt like it touched on a lot of stuff to a certain level a lot of times, and like explained it to that level a lot of times. And I'm not sure it ever went deeper for some things. Some stuff did, but I feel like there was some stuff that I got to the end of it and I was like, I swear they said at some point, we'll explain that later. And I don't feel like it was ever explained.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that, but it's not...
It's not going to be an easy thing to do, is it?
It's not going to be an easy thing
that.
to do, and I can kind of imagine that some of the stuff that they were trying to explain is kind of quite medically technical as well.
And when it comes to the structure of it, like the fact that so many of these things, so many of the symptoms, so many aspects of it are going to connect with each other, right? They're going to intersect, and therefore you can't just go off on a branch and explain that one because then you've forgotten where you were. And I appreciate that that's really difficult. And like, genuinely, this is going to seem off topic, but it'll make sense. My least favourite thing at uni and at college, to be fair, was writing essays and trying to make them linear. You know, when my brain was like, I have all these ideas about, for example, this book that I'm writing about or whatever. How on earth do I put them in a logical order in an essay where someone can follow it from start to bottom and they feel like I've taken them on a journey and they've understood everything at the point they've needed to understand it without having to use things like, we'll talk about that later, and put it off. Like, I can fully appreciate that bringing a book together that covers all this masses of different things about menopause, the different ways it can affect different people, that's going to be really hard. I just don't feel like this did it quite well enough. I'm not downplaying the difficulty of doing it. I just don't think it achieved it, unfortunately.
It kind of makes... So I was reading a couple of reviews of the actual book online, and from the way they described how the book is structured, they've got like colour coding in there. So Dr. Naomi's sections are kind of, I think, in a different colour to Davina's sections. So maybe... like visually it might make a little bit more sense than it does in the audio. Potentially,
and this was one thing that I thought while I was listening to it, was that if I were coming to this book really to learn about it, and certainly if it was because I thought it was affecting me at the moment and I wanted to know more about my own symptoms and I wanted to know more about what stuff I should be taking to my doctor, what I should be asking my doctor, which I think they do a good job in this book of saying, about arming yourself for your appointment. That, but I was also thinking that I think I would need it in some sort of written copy.
Yeah.
Because especially things like, the name of the different
hormones.
Medicines. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, certainly for my brain at least, I would need the copy. And that's not in any way me saying that this shouldn't be an audio. It fully definitely should. And especially for people who can't access the written, amazing. And hopefully they can still get what they need from it in that research sense. But I think if you're going to it for the research and you can access the written, maybe that would be better for you, or at least to have both, or access to both, because I think I would need that if I was going to properly research and sort out my own symptoms, sort out what I need to ask my doctor for, weigh up what are the best things for me. I think I would need that in a written form. However, the situation I'm in at the moment, where it's about awareness, and I don't necessarily need to know those nitty-gritty details, but I need to have a overall view of it. I thought the audio was perfect because I wouldn't have sat and read that book.
Yeah.
I know I wouldn't. And partly, if it weren't for the fact that it was on this list, I might not have picked up the audio, unfortunately. But I'm glad that I did. Really glad that I did. I'm really glad that it was an audio for me, because I think that was the way that I needed to absorb this. And especially because of how difficult it is. I would have so easily put the book down and never picked it up again. Yeah. But the fact that someone was talking it through with me, the fact that Davina was, and she's an eccentric character, but that can help pull you along through it, and these testimonials, having them spoken out and stuff like that, I do think I needed that for what I was taking from the book, which was this awareness thing. But I think if I was going for the detail, I'd need it in the written.
Yeah. Yeah, I can completely understand. So I've got another couple of criticisms that I want to bring up quite quickly. So because there are so many contributors to the book, there are varying levels of audio quality. Some of them do sound like they were recorded in like a broom closet or something. Some of the audio, I think, felt a little bit rough to my ears. It didn't feel as polished as the anecdote sections or Davina's or Dr. Naomi's sections felt. And then how well you get along with this book is how much you get along with Davina, because there is a lot of her in this, and like for me, while I felt her performance had a lot of like genuine warmth and there was a lot of passion and anger in there, which I found quite engaging, there was a little bit of kind of like rah 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 cheerleader stuff in there, which your mileage may vary on that. I did find it occasionally a little bit grating, her saying, "Oh, that's amazing," and kind of, I fully appreciate those are probably genuine emotions that she's feeling and expressing and stuff. But for me, I would find that a little bit, if I was speaking to someone like that, I'd be a little bit, oh God, can I please get away from you? So it will depend on how well you kind of like, if you like Davina, this is like a great listen. If you find her grating, even if the subject you find interesting, probably read the book instead. I don't know.
Get you. Yeah, no. And I think, like you're saying about the, the thank you so muches and stuff, I think it was really good. And as you say, I think it does come from a genuine place, that she was thanking all these people. I did worry that she'd maybe got herself into a rut. That I think not a rut, but
she got herself in a difficult same place. Phrases over and over.
Yes,
again.
But because once you've thanked somebody so much, okay, then the next person, if you don't thank them so much, then are you telling them that you're not thanking them as much as the person before? Yeah. And then maybe this is just me and my brain, but I think you get into it, oh my God, I need to make them feel just as thanked as the other person. And that, she potentially ran out of phrases. And I mean, I find it myself in just genuinely just like emails from work. Yeah. And like, I'll be like, thank you so much. This is really appreciated. And then I take a step back and be like, it wasn't actually that big of a deal, but big deal. Or like, there'll be one where it is a really big deal, and I really want them to know that they have genuinely like made my day at work and possibly my week at work so much better by having done this for me, whatever it is. But then like, that's so bigged up, and I'm like, but I thanked someone else this much in my last email, so I have to big this person up way more, and I did feel, she got in there a bit, but it was less those thank yous that I felt were very rah-rah of Davina, and more the kind of, come on girls, we can do this, that I think she took, I think she kind of admits this, straight from her exercise DVDs, that was just a bit, I don't respond super well to that kind of encouragement. I think it kind of makes me revolt and makes me go, God, if you're going to tell me to do that, I'm going to do the literal opposite kind of thing. So yes, I think there is definitely a thing about this, is that this is Davina's book. Definitely. It has so many contributors, and I'm not saying Davina is to be credited with everything in this book. That is not at all what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is this book is Davina's book. And if you're wanting to learn about menopause and you're not wanting to learn it from Davina's perspective necessarily, then I think be grateful for the fact that her platform has made this conversation happen more, and find out that information whatever way you want to find out that information. If you're a fan of Davina, then also come to this book and love the Davina aspects of it. I think, whether you actually enjoy this audiobook or not, there's no denying the positive, amazing impact that it's had and that her platform has been able to bring to it. But yes, maybe it's not going to be your favourite way to consume knowledge about the menopause if you're not the massive Davina fan.
I think, like for me, I found the book enlightening in the true sense of that word, because it did kind of bring me to awareness of things that I didn't know much about. But yeah, it's I can completely understand why it's on the shortlist. It's made some very interesting kind of like editorial decisions in terms of the way they did the readings of the anecdotes, and Davina's performance on its own merits deserves like a nomination in itself as well.
I also, just one last thing on it that I think is worth noting, because it's something that I wasn't aware of going into this book, is how focused it is specifically on hormone replacement therapy in the menopause. Because I had, not reading the blurbs or anything, taking it very much at face value of thinking about it being about the menopause in general, which it is, but it is very much through the lens of Davina saying, this is the thing that really helped me, and either kind of ways that it might help you, ways where certain people, for reasons such as, for example, cancer, may or may not be able to access it, or may only be able to access different types of it. Delivery methods, it was talking about kind of, you've got patches, you've got gels, you've got oral tablets, all sorts of different ways on it. But I was surprised by how focused it was on that. And I think it doesn't push it, I don't think, when you look at it objectively, but while I was listening to it, I sort of felt like it was being pushed. I don't know if that makes any sense, but like, I'm not giving it a criticism of, oh my God, you're pushing for, this particular treatment. I think it displayed it very objectively. However, my experience of it, probably wrongly so, was that I did feel a bit like it was being pushed on. It felt slightly cultish. Right? It's not, and I think that would be a wrong thing to say of the book, but that was, I guess, my feeling of it, and I think that does come from stuff like, it talks about basically the fact that there was a study that linked it to certain things, and just my kind of risk aversion and stuff like that. It talks about the fact that people hear that headline, and then that's the only thing they can associate with it for ages. It's all those sorts of things, in that I'm just saying my personal reaction to it was I did have a physical sort of chest tighteningness, in that I felt uncomfortable. I felt like something unsafe was being pushed on me. And like, when I listened to the words, that wasn't at all what it was doing. It really wasn't. It was talking about the issues of, as we know from things like vaccines and stuff, how one bad study, one badly interpreted set of results can have a really damaging effect on widespread health, right? And it's saying, stuff might not be sensible for you, but this was right for me, and it's doing all the right things. But still, more in my own brain, I felt uncomfortable. Partly, like I say, because I wasn't expecting it to be so focused on hormone replacement therapy, and then it was, and maybe that surprised me a bit. I don't know what you thought about all that.
I kind of agree. It was very much focused. I think part of it was her trying to maybe influence kind of like the wider medical community to make HRT more readily available and more easily available to people. But I can, and maybe that's part of the reason why she was kind of pushing its benefits, which, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor. If there's sound medical evidence that it does have these effects, these positive effects, then so be it. But I can completely understand why you might get the sense that it's slightly propaganda-y-ish.
I guess that's the word I was looking for. And it wasn't even that I was necessarily thinking like, this isn't right for me, stop pushing it on me. It wasn't that. It was exactly what you say. It was just me feeling like this book was propagandary. And, and it's that sense that rhetorical techniques, basically, all sorts of persuasion, everything of persuasion, can be used for bad, can be used for evil, or can be used to make positive change and stuff like that. But I think when you recognise the techniques and you know how those have been used badly, it can feel wrong. I think that's what it was. I think I was recognising that if this were talking about something else, it could be presented in exactly the same way. And like, how do you tell the difference kind of thing? That, it did feel awkward. And yes, I want to reiterate, I'm not saying that it's doing this. That isn't objectively what I thought of the book. But it was an interesting sort of, visceral reaction from me where I was like, this feels uncomfortable. The way that it's being pushed.
Kind of important to recognise as well. Yeah. Cool. So let's conclude our discussion on that. I think we both found it enlightening. It had some brilliant performances as well, but there were a few flaws, as there are in every audiobook. Do you want to read out the blurb for Parenting Hell, please?
I do indeed. So, Parenting Hell. The madness, absurdity, and utter chaos of being a parent from the hosts of the #1 smash hit podcast. Read, improvised, and embellished by Rob and Josh, with special guest appearances by their wives, Rose and Lou, podcast producer Michael, and Rob's parents, Sue and Dave. What is it really like to be a parent? And how come no one ever warned Rob or Josh of the sheer mind-bending, world-altering, sleep-depriving, sick-covering, tear-inducing, snot-wiping, bore-inspiring, 4am relationship-straining brutality of it all? And if they did, why can't they remember it? Or remember anything else, for that matter? And just when they thought it couldn't get any harder, why didn't anyone warn them about the slices of unmatched euphoric joy and pride that occasionally come piercing through, drenching you in unbridled happiness, in much the same way a badly burped baby drenches you in milk sick? Join Josh and Rob as they share the challenges and madness of their parenting journeys with lashings of empathy and extra helpings of laughs. Filled with all the things they never tell you at antenatal classes, Parenting Hell is a beguiling mixture of humour, rumination, and conversation for prospective parents, new parents, old parents, and never-to-be parents alike.
So, my first question to you, I'm going to phrase it like this. They say the English language isn't a language, it's 3 other languages stacked on top of each other, wearing a trench coat, looking to steal slang words. So my first question to you, with that in mind, is this an audiobook or is this a podcast?
Oh, okay. I like it.
Yeah.
We know I love things that break boundaries and blur the lines, and I think it is a bit of a mixture. It's a bit of a combination.
Yeah.
So yeah, for people who haven't listened to it yet, the embellishments that it sort of talks about there, basically you had Rob and Josh in the studio together, and I actually remember seeing pictures of them on their Instagrams where they were in the studio together as they read their own sections, and then the other one tends to chirp in.
Yeah.
And I think it helps that their sections are quite short anyway. They sort of would write, a certain number of paragraphs and then it swaps over to the other person anyway. That sort of opens up for this dialogue. But yeah, I was amazed, but I absolutely love it. The fact that they had these embellishments in there, that they had, Josh reaches the end of his section, and before Rob says his, he'll have a jib at what Josh has just said as they're recording it in the studio. They'll talk about, I fluffed that word a little bit. I said that in a bit of a weird way. They'll compliment each other on each other's jokes, which I thought was great. And they're like, that was a bit of good that, and things throughout it that was fantastic. This was clearly a directive that was given, just for the fact of, the fact that they were in studio together, the fact that so much of it was allowed in there, it was clearly an active decision. But there was also a bit where Rob says something like, is that the kind of input they're looking for? So they've clearly been asked to do this, right? And it's the kind of thing that you can only ask of performers like them, of comedians, or at the very least of professional performers, that they can ad-lib that kind of stuff and have that kind of rapport. But I love that they did it. As much as I love kind of, sticking to what the book says, I think it was amazing that these bits were in there. I think it heightens it. And yeah, as you say, it brings it sort of like a podcast. Yeah. I would say my answer to your question, if you would force me to, is I do think it's an audiobook.
Yeah.
And I think it's an audiobook where they have let in extra little bits of the recording process in there. They've let extra little discussions in there. Aside from, I think, the interviews, which are more like podcast episodes, at least the ones that are live interviews, as opposed to those which we might go on to talk about, they kind of cross over to that. But I do think this is an audiobook that has some, back and forth joy of a podcast in there, but I don't think it's just a really long podcast. I think one thing that's really interesting about this, to be fair, having not listened to their podcast though, but that I can see that it must be distinct from it, because they do go through kind of their parenting journeys in a very structured way, in a very logical way. I think this book specifically is structured really well in the different areas of parenting that it looks at, the order that it does those in. I do think this is an audio book, but I love that they've not let the audiobookness constrain them to, we will just read out the words on the page, that they have let these really funny comedic moments slip in there by having them, read it across the room from each other as if they're, doing their podcast.
I think it must have been like a massive boon for the company doing the production on this, to have two people that do regularly podcast with each other together. That must be such a massive advantage when you're coming to recording, because they're used to kind of like the audio setup, they're used to kind of speaking to a microphone. they're both comedians, so they're both really practicing kind of like performing words as
But
well.
then again, I would argue they probably wouldn't think that as much, given that they work with professional narrators every day.
Yeah.
Who obviously will know all of that stuff much more.
Yeah.
But I think certainly if it wasn't their idea, if it was the publisher's idea, or whoever's idea it was, the fact that they had people who could do these ad-libbing bits so naturally, that must have been amazing, and it must have been so fun to work on. Especially if we're comparing this, they often work with professional narrators who know how to get the book spot on as it's written. It must have been such like a liberating joy to have the artistic license to let things like that joking around about the thing that you've just read be part of the work itself. Like, that must have been great to like allow time to joke about the book. That maybe if you crunch deadline, we got to get this thing narrated and recorded, you're not going to be able to have that sort of back and forth jokiness happen in your recording. So that must have been wonderful.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about the kind of actual book itself. So both Rob and Josh, I think both this book and Menopausing kind of explore kind of what your expectations of certain life events are going to be, and then kind of the actual reality kind of is. So one of the things that kind of immediately struck me when I was listening to it is kind of both of them talking about their decision to kind of have children and how that came about, and both of them had kind of like slightly different journeys. Forgive me, I can't remember, was it Rob's wife that kind of had quite serious medical conditions, or was it Josh's?
Lou.
Yes, so Rob talking about kind of his stress around and stress and anxiety around that, and the worry that they had whether or not they would be able to conceive, and kind of the medical risks in that's not something that gets talked about a lot, I don't think.
Yeah, that had a real crossover with Menopausing, and especially because I think the same condition that Lou has is actually mentioned in Menopausing as well. And so, I do think this does a good job of broaching that, and I was really glad that Lou was happy for them to share her story, that she was happy to share it herself in a bit in her section, and that I think that was really important that sort of stuff's acknowledged and talked about. Similarly, Rose and Josh talk about the fact that, or at least Josh talks about the fact that they lost a pregnancy, and opening up that discussion around miscarriage, broaching it rather than ignoring it, I think is really important that is part of it in there. And as you say, kind of linked with what we were just talking about with Menopausing, about it's always better to open these discussions up and make sure people are more aware of the complications and things like that can be part of it. Definitely. Another more fun crossover between the two of them is that we hadn't mentioned is that there were some bits in Menopausing where Davina also came up with something while she was reading it and decided to add that in just for the audiobook listeners. It's not in any way to the same extent as this one, but there was a little bit of that in there, which was quite good as well.
Yeah. Both of them talk quite extensively about how much they're in love with their wives, and kind of how much support their wives gave them kind of early on in their career, and how they kind of eventually came to the decision to kind of like start a family with each other. So I found those sections quite interesting. The other major like note that I've got written down is, the audiobook is filled with like a lot of anecdotes from like their life pre-baby, then kind of post-baby, but both of them really hit on strongly on the point on how stressful they found the actual childbirth itself, and they want to kind of dispel the myth that it's kind of this magical thing, and say no, actually it's really stressful. And you're going to be, your wife gives birth and you're really stressed out. It can quite often be kind of quite a long procedure. She's going to be tired, she's kind of emotionally, physically exhausted, then you're expected to take home a human life and like look after it, and it's just you're not ready for that level of exhaustion. So I was just wondering what you kind of like felt about that.
Definitely. They do definitely say about the stress, and it was interesting so these are two comedians that I've followed for a long time, both through stand-up and through different shows that they've been on. Watched The Last Leg a lot, big fan of that, big fan of Rob and the shows that he does, big fan of both of them on Taskmaster. These are people that I love them so much. I think they're very funny, but it was really interesting in this, and probably you do get this if you listen to the podcast, but seeing more of them behind the performer, more of who they really are, you know, and not just the person that you see on these shows. And, you know, I'm not saying that they're massively different, but it's things like that. It's things like they'll acknowledge stuff like how stressed they get about things like that, you know, and it's not just because it's the butt of a joke. It's the genuine reality of, I got really nervous about this, and this was really stressful, and it's something that I find difficult. And, you know, especially with how, you know, bubbly Rob is, and, you know, that's not put on. It's very much talked about how sometimes he's got too much bubbly energy for Lou to be happy with. He's a bit too optimistic and playful. But to see, you know, that other side of the fear and the stress that can really be there, especially with, the difficult part of the birth and stuff like that, was really interesting to see that. And yeah, important to consider it as a factor. I think this book does do a good job of, I think like the blurb says, it does do a very good job of explaining both the highs and the lows of pregnancy, of conceiving, of rearing children. Is rearing the right word? Of raising children.
Yeah, raising children. I think you rear sheep, don't you?
Rear sheep, well, that was my worry. So yeah, I think this is a really good job of, like, I think displaying it quite honestly. And I was sort of saying to people when I've been talking about this, in that it didn't convince me that I would want kids, but not because it displays it in a bad way. I think because it displays it quite honestly. It shows the absolute amazing, like it says, euphoric, just wonderful love that makes it so wonderful and so worthwhile for some people. But then also shows the ways that it's not great, you know, sleep deprivation, not having any time for yourself, the stress, just like, I think it gives a very honest view of it, and in the way that I could sort of step out of myself and see how other people could finish the book and be like, wow, yeah, it's tough, but it's worth it. But I could also be kind of within myself being like, sounds great, but it's not worth it. You know, I felt it did a really good job of just displaying it honestly, that I thought was good. Though I did think, kind of, I guess, on that discussion of people deciding if they do and they don't, and the blurb ending with that kind of like never to be parent stuff, I was kind of surprised that there was some of that, like, parent judgment on people who've decided not to be parents stuff. Like, there was some jealousy of their free time, but then there was also, like, some judgment of, and as if they could just mooch on a Sunday, like, is that not a bit sad now? And it's like, well, no, they have the time to mooch on a Sunday and they want to. So there was a tiny bit of judgmentiness in there, but I really definitely do not think that you would be alienated from it if you listen to this and you're dead set that you don't want to be a parent. That's really not the impression here at all. And I think if you are not a parent, you're not planning to be a parent, kids are not a factor in your life, still listen to this, right? It's great. It is really, really good. And, like, obviously it is heavily focused on children. Of course it is. But that doesn't stop anyone where children aren't really in their life from enjoying it, because these are two fantastic comedians that are talking about a topic, and they make that topic funny, and they make that topic sad and human, and they do an incredible performance that just, especially if you're fans of Rob and Josh, listen to this whether kids are a thing in your life or not. And then I also imagine that if kids are a thing in your life and you don't know Rob and Josh, that you would also then really enjoy this, for connecting with it in those ways, and maybe, getting on with their comedy and their humour. Yeah,
so I'd kind of agree with quite a lot of that. One of the interesting things is this is maybe the first kind of like pandemic book
that
I've read, because I think they started the podcast during the pandemic, and throughout the book there's kind of quite a lot of references about how the pandemic affected the way that they were able to parent their children. So I felt that was kind of quite interesting to look, because it kind of, my home situation is I do live with 2 children, and having seen that kind of experience reflected back onto me was quite interesting. And it does kind of make me wonder, like, long term, what effect that's going to have on children. Having lived through that experience, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree with what you said, and I think obviously it is a point that everyone who was alive during that period, be that they've just been born or, are a really old person and everyone in between, like, it will have affected for sure. And it will be affecting to come. In some ways, there's been some positive changes, obviously, but there's obviously going to have been some impact, and we don't know what that's going to be. And that is definitely interesting. And God, it was like one of the hardest things of being, having and raising children, and then you've got to throw all that complication into it. It's just like, oh God. So no, there was a lot of sympathy I was feeling there. And I think they did a good balance of like, I didn't feel too much shoved back to that time and the negative associations with it. I felt like it was well acknowledged. But it didn't make me feel like, oh God, the pandemic that I sort of in some ways just want to forget. It felt like a good balance, really, if they were talking about it. A bit like what I said before. It was done nice and realistically. It acknowledged it. It didn't try and pretend that it wasn't a factor. Raised some interesting points about it. Made some funny comments in it, as you would obviously expect. But yeah, didn't focus on it too much. It was appropriate context, I guess.
Yeah, it was appropriate context, I think. That's true. So let's actually talk a little bit about one of the things I did like about the book. It is split up into chapters, and each chapter is about a particular subject, and the people that read out the chapter heading are children from around the world. And that was really sweet that they chose to make that editorial decision.
I thought, it was a great idea that someone came up with to do that. Yeah, so basically you have a little kid, or sometimes there's a couple of them, reading out the chapter heading, and then you have Rob and Josh reading it out again in case potentially you've not quite caught it from
which
what
was
the
most
kid
of the
had
time.
said.
It was most of the time, yeah.
And they were also, they did the thing we brought up with Davina, in that they backed themselves into a bit of a corner, because if they said, oh, that was great, for the next one, they had to say at least that level of great, if not more. And I think, they possibly backed themselves into a corner a bit with that as well. And that was also the first inkling that you get that this isn't just a straight read of the print book.
Yeah.
Because, you have the fact that literally you've got these other voices. Well, obviously that's a feature that's only going to be there in audio. And then you had the fact that you had the two of them discussing the voice that they just heard, which also means, they must have been playing them in the studio while they were recording it. Kind of cool. And a nice insight into how that process was done, which is nice. But that was cool. And so I actually ended up, because I was so intrigued as to what was and what wasn't in the written book, I had that up for some of it. And they had little, like, you know how certain articles have like big bold of a section from the article or a quote that they think's really important and kind of sums it up? So that's sort of what they have in the print. You have the chapter heading, and then you have that. And I'm quite glad they didn't do that in the audio. Probably just personal taste, but I quite liked that instead you got organically just following the chapter as it went. And certainly, as substitutes go, substituting it for the kids talking and them talking about the kids talking was a really cute thing to do. And then sort of connected with that, so I also had it up when I was listening to the interviews. So another great thing about this book, as it mentions, is that there are interviews with different members of their family. So you've got both Rob and Josh's wives and both of their parents, and also Michael, their producer on the podcast. And they're split in different ways between, you've got two lots of organic interviews, in the sense that like they went and recorded an interview with them. So they recorded an interview with Rose, and they recorded an interview with Sue and Dave, Rob's parents. So that's Josh's wife, Rob's parents. And then they had, Lou had, because she'd wanted to, she'd written out her responses to the questions, and then she'd read them. Was her interview part. And then you had in the audio, Rob was then giving his opinion on what she'd just said. Some of it being criticisms of Rob, and some of it, in all fairness, him being like, yeah, that's fair. Which was really funny. And then you had Josh's parents, who weren't able to get there for a recording, but you had their answers to the questions being read out. So, that was kind of how those interviews went. I thought, great that you have their perspective in there. And I certainly get the impression that's something that the listeners of the podcast have been wanting for a long time. And then, I thought it was really interesting as a definite asset of the audio for certainly those ones that were done as talking face-to-face interviews. It sounded so much better than it did when I read it. Like, when I was looking along with the ebook on it, hearing that, because those bits are like a podcast and they're just meant to be listened to, and it was just so much better listening to them rather than just reading them. As well as, I think, there was some stuff cut out in the print, but equally I think there was some stuff in the written that was maybe cut out of the audio. It's interesting, and I feel like I kind of, just for sense of completeness and, I don't know, FOMO or whatever, I feel like I need both. And I do have, as much as I love the fact when the audio has something extra, there is always still a part of me that's like, the flip side of what we talk about a lot of the time. Okay, but what if people can't access the audio?
Yeah.
And I feel kind of sad that they don't get the same experience in the print necessarily, which is possibly a bit of a shame of the fact that stuff's cut out. But yeah, definitely, if you can listen to the audio, that is a great asset of the audio, that you have these mini podcast episodes in there. And certainly when you have the ones where the responses were read out, you then have the added bonus that as they're in the studio and they give their thoughts on them, you get that added content as well. That is just fantastic.
So like for me, this is the way you kind of like should do footnotes in audio, if that makes sense. Kind of like, them saying their thing and then, oh, this is the footnote. It's kind of very breezy, conversational. This is kind of the kind of a comment on the text that you've just listened to. So yeah.
And I thought a similar thing. And also there was one point, don't know if this was directed or if he just did this naturally. There was a point where Josh was saying something, Rob interrupted him. They had a little conversation, and then Josh kind of went back to the start of the sentence that he'd started and did it again.
Yeah.
And while, you could argue, oh yeah, but that's repetition and could you edit it out and all that stuff, I think that worked really well. And it sort of made me think a little, can that be maybe how footnotes get done? Can it be proper to read the sentence out, then read the footnote out, then maybe read that sentence again? Because that's the issue with putting footnotes into audio, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that's the reason they're footnotes, that's the reason they're separate, is because they don't work to be there where they're placed in the text, because the sentences follow on from each other. And therefore, I really quite liked the fact that he went back and went again. And I feel like, that's a really good way to include that sort of additional information, is don't worry about the fact that you've repeated a bit. It's going to make sense to people. They get all the info, but just take it back to the start of the previous sentence and just go again.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really good.
Yeah. The other thing they talk quite heavily about in the book is kind of like parenting styles and how you need like a different kind of mix of personalities when you're a couple, and kind of what is the phrase that they use? They use the phrase like stiff neck and
loose neck, which I gather is definitely a thing of the podcast, I think.
Yeah, so I think one of the sections I enjoyed the most was the section where Rob and Josh are kind of like not necessarily criticizing each other's personalities, but saying, well, you're definitely a loose neck because you do this, and you're definitely a stiff neck because you do that. And then
there was so much banter. It was great.
Yeah, I found that the fascinating thing was how that led into kind of like their parenting styles and how their wives were basically saying, well, Robbie's a loose neck. He's on the road a lot. And then like what he'll do is he'll kind of like come back in and then get the kids all hyped up before they go to bed. And then he'll just leave. And then it's kind of like that, that sort of stuff I found quite interesting as well. How did you find those sections where they're kind of contrasting their kind of personalities and their parenting styles?
Yeah, definitely. I found it really funny. And I found it funny, the kind of thinking that, they're sort of showing how, like, Lou is sort of more similar to Josh in who she is, but that obviously...
there's that section where she was kind of, like, talking about the spreadsheet.
Yeah, exactly.
God,
But I thought that was kind of nice because it was sort of like how, opposite people kind of complement each other and stuff like that I quite liked. That, and it was what made it great that the three of them recorded together Lou's parts, because you sort of had the two of them being in connection with each other over like, I'd be the same. And yet Rob was different, you know, it was like, and they could band together a little bit, gang up it on him slightly, but kind of share that friendship and stuff that I thought was really interesting, And really interesting how it blends with the parenting styles. It kind of shows, this is not in any way me criticising Josh as a parent, but like how fun Rob is as a dad kind of stuff, that really came across. And as a real like, oh my God, wouldn't it be amazing to have a dad like that kind of thing? Obviously not that he can't also be, the disciplinarian sometimes when he needs to and stuff like that, but it was really nice showing that sort of home life stuff. And I guess it's that kind of thing where you'd hope that a comedian would be a fun dad, and it was kind of nice to see that he was. I thought that was interesting.
So, and the last couple of things I wanted to discuss was how they talk about energy levels a lot in this book, which is, I think, also quite similar to menopausing, and kind of like how tired they both are and how that's kind of affected their ability to be social outside their immediate family unit. I found those sections quite interesting in terms of like neither one of them really wanting to kind of mix with the other parents if their kids make friends with someone, they're not particularly keen on like making friends with the parents of those kids and going out and drinking and kind of like stuff like that. How did you feel about those sections before we get to the criticisms I have of the book?
Well, it was just funny because it did, put me back to kind of when I was in primary school stuff. Especially there was this one group of parents that the families all went on holiday together. And because my parents...
That's weird. That's just weird.
Oh, but as a kid, I was like, oh, but I wish I was there. Like, they'd come back from those holidays, the Monday after they'd been on those holidays, and especially because one of them was one of my close friends. And then there was just so much of like, oh my God, I missed out because they all went to Haven together and and had an amazing time because their parents are friends, right? And but it was quite funny listening to this and imagining it less from the my kid feeling like I'd missed out on a holiday perspective and more from the like, God, how awful must it be as parents having to be friends with all the other parents kind of things and stuff like that I did find was quite amusing. It was funny, kind of, I guess, reframing some of my own memories and thinking about them from like my mum's perspective and stuff like that. Not that she didn't like those parents, and especially the close friend that I talked about, I know that she got on with her mum as well, but the kind of, I guess, like the cliques that you have of kind of the parents on the playground kind of thing is just, it's sort of politics that you just don't want to get into. That was another thing of, is the just dealing with the playground politics. It's like, that's what the kids should be doing at break times, not what adults should be having to deal with.
Cool. So I've got a couple of criticisms of the book. So again, much like Davina's book, your mileage with this will be very much dependent on how grating you find Rob and Josh's voices. I would say Rob's delivery was slightly, I don't want to say less confident, but it was a little bit stilted at times when he was reading his sections out. I say that in comparison with when he was kind of like bantering with Josh, you could kind of tell that he was really concentrating on getting the words in the right order. So I kind of found that. And I did find Josh's voice had a certain cadence, which I felt kind of, sometimes I felt the sentences kind of bled into each other a little bit, if that makes sense. It's kind of, did he just, no, he's actually saying something new. And if you find either of their voices annoying, I don't know why you'd be choosing to listen to this, but maybe probably stay away if that's the case.
I think that's so interesting though, because I hadn't really picked up on either of those things, and I'd actually felt that the readings of the bits that were written I felt they were really quite natural, and I was quite pleased with that. And because I didn't think that it was a podcast in a sense. Like I say, I do think it was an audiobook. The concept of what this is when you format it to audiobook, I think for the majority of the time there were a couple of adaptations or maybe non-adaptations that didn't quite match up with this, but what I felt was you were at a reading of this book, and I liked that, right? And like, I think there are audiobooks that sound like you are being spoken to, and there are audiobooks that sound like you are being read to. And this one, obviously, ignoring the parts where you're literally hearing their conversation, right? I felt like you were being read to, but not in that sense that we've criticised before. So like we criticised it for Bob's, I think. That a lot of it, you could tell that he was trying to speak written prose. I didn't feel that so much with these. I felt more that they were reading out a book, but it felt quite natural, is how I found it.
I would actually say, I think what you just said there about Bob, I did find that occasionally with Rob's section that I did feel like he was reading out kind of the written word, and it maybe so, I mean, but that was only in certain sections, and maybe that's just me being a little bit picky about it. The other thing that I would kind of say about the book is, unless you're a big fan of Josh or Rob, unless you're interested in hearing about other people's children, I don't think there's a great deal of like interest in this for people that don't have any interest in children or don't have an interest in parenting, which is kind of as opposed to like Davina's book, where I think there's a subject that definitely everyone should read about and be enlightened about. I mean, they say themselves is kind of like listening to stories about other people's children can be like really boring. They didn't, they're skilled entertainers and they made all the stories entertaining, and the stories were really more about their experiences and expectations and kind of things of that nature. But it's just one of those things to kind of bear in mind as well.
This is where I think I disagree with you slightly, in that I think if you have no interest in Rob and Josh and you have no interest in kids, fair enough, fine, you can give it a miss. However, I think if you have any interest in one or more of those things, then you should listen to this. And it's difficult for me to say from a perspective of people who don't like Rob and Josh, because I really do.
Yeah.
But I wasn't interested in the kids bit from that perspective. That's why I've not listened to the podcast, right? Yeah. However, I really like them, and, you know, I really loved listening to this because of that. Because I was listening to them and their experiences. A bit like I said before, it was sort of like, it's comedians making great content about a topic. And no, I'm not really that interested in that topic, but they do a great thing. And therefore, I think that, if you're into parenting, they do a great job of making this really comedic, really engaging, that I think was brilliant. And therefore, I think, even if you don't really know the two of them, maybe not if you dislike them, but if you don't really know the two of them, you're not really sure about parenting, I think it is just an entertaining book in general. I just think it's really funny. I think it's kind of like, it's a different medium to stand up, but I think it has the same kind of stuff where you have a performer who's talking about their life and their experiences, which might not be anything to do with your life, but they still make it funny and entertaining. And I just thought in general this was a really entertaining book. And as we've said before, I think if you're interested in audio, if you're interested in what audiobooks can be and breaking those boundaries, is really interesting. I think it helped me break out from that box I was potentially shoving myself into, of feeling like it should be exact, it should be with it. Liberated me in that sense of being like, wow, okay, this is the kind of artistic freedom you can take, and it's great. And I'm glad that someone did it, rather than thinking, oh, okay, we have to strictly do what it says in the book. So I think it's a really entertaining listen from so many different perspectives. And I would definitely recommend it.
Yeah, I'd recommend it as well, but with those provisos that I just mentioned before. So I think both books have got kind of interesting parallels. Both talk about experiences that a lot of people go through, and it will affect almost everyone in one way or another. And both of them make really interesting editorial decision, kind of the way they've decided to record the book. Like, Davina with the dramatic readings of the anecdotes in the book, and with Rob and Josh's book, kind of really pushing that boundary between audiobook and podcasting, and kind of that freedom of having like joint narrators bouncing off each other. Great. So the next episode that we will be doing will be discussing another two books on the shortlist. The first of which will be A Visible Man by Edward Ennefel, and 10 Steps to Nanette by Hannah Gatsby. Okay, guys, thank you very much for listening to the episode. If you've got any feedback at all, please get in contact with us either over social media. Our handles is at AudiobookishPod. You'll find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can get in contact with the podcast by emailing audiobookishpod@gmail.com. Thank you once again to the British Book Awards for selecting us as one of their supporters. It's a really fantastic and exciting opportunity, and it's really great to bring some more spotlight to the fantastic books on the shortlist. Any closing comments, Poppy?
No, I think you summed that up great. Yeah, two great books to listen to, and I look forward to the next ones on the shortlist.
Okay, guys, let's say bye. Bye.
Bye.